In this video, we will begin examining the default remedy available to the buyer in the event the seller breaches a contract by never tendering the goods that she was obligated to. That default remedy is the legal remedy of money damages. And we will start this examination by considering first one measure of the buyer's money damages, specifically the buyer's cover remedy. Returning to Section 711 of Article 2, as an alternative to forcing the breaching seller to perform, the buyer may, under subsection 1, cancel the contract, recover any of the purchase price already paid to the seller, and seek damages against the seller for the seller's breach. Now let's consider each of these individually, starting first with the cancellation of the party's contract. Let's review for a moment. What is the effect of canceling a contract? Recall what we said in last week's module, that cancellation is a remedy for breach. Where the buyer cancels due to the seller's failure to tender the goods, the buyer's obligation to perform under the contract is discharged and excused, so the buyer is no longer obligated to pay any amounts still due under the contract. In addition, the buyer retains the right to obtain damages from the seller for the seller's breach. Note, Article 2 does not prescribe a procedure for canceling a contract. It does not even require notice of cancellation by one party to the other, although in practice such notice would be of course prudent. In addition to cancellation, if the buyer has already paid the seller for the goods in full or in part, then the buyer is entitled to recover that amount because the goods were never tendered by the seller. And finally, in addition, the buyer will be entitled to recover damages from the seller. What is the appropriate measure of damages here? That will be the focus of this video and for the rest of this week's module. Article 2 sets forth detailed provisions providing explicit statutory formulas to compute damages. But as you consider these provisions, it is important that you do not lose sight of the underlying principle, which is to protect the expectation interest of the non-breaching party, the buyer in this scenario. The goal is always to place the non-breaching party in the position she expected to be, the position she would have been had the contract been fully performed, had there been no breach. Indeed, Section 305 of Article 1 says that the UCC's provisions should be liberally administered to this end. So the detailed provisions under Article 2, providing explicit statutory formulas to compute damages, may be thought of more as strong suggestions and not rigid rules. Where the situation calls for it, under Section 305 of Article 1, the provisions of Article 2 may be modified, combined, or ignored altogether in order to achieve the singular aim of protecting the expectation interest of the party that is the victim of the breach. So at the end of any remedies analysis, it's always worth asking, does this remedy really protect the expectation interest of the non-breaching party, or would another remedy do so more appropriately? With that fundamental principle in mind, how are the buyer's damages calculated under Article 2? Section 711 under subsection 1 offers two possibilities. The first is cover damages pursuant to Section 712 of Article 2, which we will examine in the remainder of this video. The second is market-based damages pursuant to Section 713 of Article 2, which we will examine in the next video. So let's start with cover damages first. Pursuant to Section 712, where the seller fails to tender the goods when due, thus breaching the party's contract, the buyer may enter into another contract with another seller to purchase substitute goods, goods like those that the breaching seller was supposed to provide under the breached contract. Where the buyer elects to exercise its cover remedy under 712 of Article 2, the buyer's direct damages are equal to the difference between the cost of the cover minus the cost of the goods under the breached contract. This number represents the measure of the buyer's direct damages arising from the seller's breach. As we will explore in a later video, however, the buyer may also be entitled to indirect damages for the buyer's incidental and consequential losses resulting from the seller's breach. In practice, cover is a common scenario. Typically, a buyer has a good reason to cover. The buyer might well want or need the goods that she contracted for, the goods that the breaching seller failed to provide. But the cover remedy also creates a risk of opportunism or exploitation by the buyer, because once the buyer has canceled the breached contract, the breaching seller is liable for damages resulting from the buyer's cover transaction. Thus, in that scenario, the buyer has little incentive to get the best price for the substitute goods. Instead, the buyer's incentive is to upgrade, to find substitute goods that are perhaps even better than what the breaching seller was supposed to provide, knowing that whatever additional amounts the buyer pays for those substitute goods will be paid for by the breaching seller. 712 aims to prevent this kind of opportunism by placing limits on the buyer's cover remedy. This is a good opportunity for you to now practice the skill of statutory interpretation. Press pause now and identify the 3 limits that 712 places on the buyer's right to cover. So let's see how you did. As we said, Section 712 of Article 2 places 3 limits on the buyer's recovery of cover damages. First, the buyer must cover in good faith. So the buyer's choice in a cover transaction is subject to both the subjective and objective standards of good faith. Applying the subjective standard, the buyer cannot pick the most expensive cover option out of spite, out of retribution against the breaching seller. And applying the objective standard of good faith, the buyer must be commercially reasonable in finding the best price in a cover transaction. The buyer need not be perfect, especially under the circumstances the buyer has been placed in by the breaching seller, but the buyer's cover must be at least commercially reasonable. The second limitation is that the buyer's cover must be undertaken without unreasonable delay. So the buyer cannot play the market at the seller's expense. The buyer cannot wait to see if the market price for the goods will go down so that the buyer winds up paying less than what the buyer was originally contracted to pay the seller, something that a buyer may otherwise be tempted to do if the buyer believes that if the market price for the goods goes up instead, there would be no harm to the buyer because the seller would be liable to the buyer for any increase in the price of the substitute goods. The requirement that the buyer must cover without unreasonable delay prevents this kind of opportunism by the buyer. Finally, the goods bought by the buyer in her cover transaction must be a reasonable substitute for the goods that the breaching seller was supposed to provide. So the buyer cannot try to upgrade on the quality of the goods in a cover transaction. To be sure, sometimes some differences between the breaching seller's goods and the cover goods may be unavoidable, and some differences will be generally tolerated by the courts. After all, the buyer did not choose to be in this position of having to cover and find substitute goods. The buyer is only in this position because the seller breached its contractual obligation to the buyer. Even so, the buyer cannot use the cover remedy to get significantly better goods as a substitute and then require the breaching seller to pay for those significantly better goods. So in this video, we began our examination of the buyer's default remedy when the seller fails to tender the goods, the default remedy of money damages, and we introduced one measure of the buyer's money damages, the buyer's cover remedy. In the next video, we will look to a second alternative measure of the buyer's damages, a measure that applies when the buyer does not cover pursuant to Section 712.